The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be the last time. 25 years of unwavering service to the crown had led to this moment, and his hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons that had gleamed proudly through countless ceremonies, state visits, and royal occasions. James had joined the King's Guard at 18, fresh-faced and eager to serve Queen Elizabeth II. He remembered the day she first inspected his unit, her keen eyes missing nothing as she moved down the line of soldiers. She had paused before him, noting his perfect posture and immaculate uniform, and offered the slightest nod of approval. That moment had shaped his entire career. The castle grounds buzzed with unusual activity. Palace staff moved with hurried purpose, preparing for what the official announcements called the transition ceremony. Following King Charles III's unexpected abdication due to serious health concerns, Queen Camilla was set to assume full monarchical powers rather than remain as queen consort. The constitutional lawyers had worked around the clock to make it legally possible, but James knew that legal and legitimate were two different things entirely. Standing at his post near the main entrance, James watched as dignitaries arrived in their black cars. Politicians, foreign ambassadors, and members of the aristocracy streamed through the gates, all coming to witness history. But for James, this felt more like watching the end of everything he had sworn to protect. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Sarah, whatever you're thinking of doing, please don't think of Emma and little Tom. They need their father." She knew him too well. Sarah had noticed his restlessness over the past weeks, the way he paced the kitchen at night muttering about oaths and duty. She understood the weight of tradition that pressed down on his shoulders. Colonel Hartwell approached, his own face grave beneath his ceremonial hat. "Morrison, I need to speak with you." The older man had been James's mentor since his early days in the Guard. He was a soldier's soldier, someone who understood the burden of absolute loyalty. "Sir," James replied, snapping to attention. "I know what you're thinking," Hartwell said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I can see it in your eyes. The same look my father had when he told me about the abdication crisis of 1936. Some moments test everything we believe in." James felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, this isn't the same situation, isn't it?" Hartwell stepped closer. A monarch stepping aside, constitutional chaos, the very foundations of what we've sworn to protect being questioned. "It's exactly the same, Morrison. The difference is how we choose to respond." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main gates. A group of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "No Queen Camilla and defend the true crown." Palace security moved quickly to disperse them, but their chants echoed across the courtyard. James felt a surge of validation. He wasn't alone in his feelings. Inside the castle, final preparations were underway for the ceremony. The stateroom had been arranged with the throne prominently displayed, though many whispered it felt wrong to see it prepared for anyone other than the late Queen Elizabeth or a direct heir. The Archbishop of Canterbury had agreed to perform the ceremony, though rumors suggested he had considerable reservations about the unprecedented nature of the proceedings. James's radio crackled to life. "All units prepare for final security sweep. Her Majesty Queen Camilla will arrive in 30 minutes. The words felt like sandpaper in his ears. Her Majesty Queen Camilla. It sounded wrong, artificial, like a title forced into existence by desperate circumstances rather than divine right or natural succession. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in the Guard during World War II. The old man had shared stories of standing watch during the Blitz, of the royal family's courage during the darkest hours of British history. "We don't serve a person, James," his grandfather had told him. "We serve an idea, a tradition that goes back 1,000 years. Never forget that." A young guardsman, Private Collins, approached nervously. "Sergeant Morrison, sir? The other lads are talking. They say you might not... that you're planning to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. James looked at the young soldier, barely 21, full of the same idealism that had once driven James himself. "What do you think, Collins?" "About all this?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "I think we swore an oath, sir." "To whoever wears the crown, did we?" James asked quietly. "Or did we swear to defend something bigger than that?" The sound of approaching motorcycles announced the royal convoy's arrival. Through the gates came the familiar black Bentley, flags flying, but something felt fundamentally different about this procession. There was no crowd of well-wishers, no sense of celebration. Even the palace staff seemed subdued as they took their positions. James checked his weapon one final time, though he knew he would never use it. The loaded rifle was symbolic, a reminder of the ultimate commitment every guard made to protect the crown. But what happened when the crown itself became the threat to everything you believed in? His radio crackled again. All units, Her Majesty has arrived. Prepare for ceremony escort duties. Through the palace windows, James could see movement in the stateroom. The Archbishop took his position, ancient words prepared for a thoroughly modern crisis. Constitutional experts had argued for weeks about the legality of the proceedings, but politics had won over precedent. James Morrison stood straighter, his decision crystallizing in his mind. 25 years of perfect service, a spotless record. Commendations from 3 monarchs all led to this moment. He thought of Queen Elizabeth's steady gaze, of his grandfather's stories, of the oath he had taken as a young man to defend the crown and realm. But which crown? And whose realm? The ceremony was about to begin, and Sergeant James Morrison was about to make the most important decision of his military career. A decision that would change everything. The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be the last time. 25 years of unwavering service to the crown had led to this moment, and his hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons that had gleamed proudly through countless ceremonies, state visits, and royal occasions. James had joined the King's Guard at 18, fresh-faced and eager to serve Queen Elizabeth II. He remembered the day she first inspected his unit, her keen eyes missing nothing as she moved down the line of soldiers. She had paused before him, noting his perfect posture and immaculate uniform, and offered the slightest nod of approval. That moment had shaped his entire career. The castle grounds buzzed with unusual activity. Palace staff moved with hurried purpose, preparing for what the official announcements called the transition ceremony. Following King Charles III's unexpected abdication due to serious health concerns, Queen Camilla was set to assume full monarchical powers rather than remain as queen consort. The constitutional lawyers had worked around the clock to make it legally possible, but James knew that legal and legitimate were two different things entirely. Standing at his post near the main entrance, James watched as dignitaries arrived in their black cars. Politicians, foreign ambassadors, and members of the aristocracy streamed through the gates, all coming to witness history. But for James, this felt more like watching the end of everything he had sworn to protect. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Sarah, whatever you're thinking of doing, please don't think of Emma and little Tom. They need their father." She knew him too well. Sarah had noticed his restlessness over the past weeks, the way he paced the kitchen at night muttering about oaths and duty. She understood the weight of tradition that pressed down on his shoulders. Colonel Hartwell approached, his own face grave beneath his ceremonial hat. "Morrison, I need to speak with you." The older man had been James's mentor since his early days in the Guard. He was a soldier's soldier, someone who understood the burden of absolute loyalty. "Sir," James replied, snapping to attention. "I know what you're thinking," Hartwell said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I can see it in your eyes. The same look my father had when he told me about the abdication crisis of 1936. Some moments test everything we believe in." James felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, this isn't the same situation, isn't it?" Hartwell stepped closer. "A monarch stepping aside, constitutional chaos, the very foundations of what we've sworn to protect being questioned." "It's exactly the same, Morrison. The difference is how we choose to respond." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main gates. A group of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "No Queen Camilla and defend the true crown." Palace security moved quickly to disperse them, but their chants echoed across the courtyard. James felt a surge of validation. He wasn't alone in his feelings. Inside the castle, final preparations were underway for the ceremony. The stateroom had been arranged with the throne prominently displayed, though many whispered it felt wrong to see it prepared for anyone other than the late Queen Elizabeth or a direct heir. The Archbishop of Canterbury had agreed to perform the ceremony, though rumors suggested he had considerable reservations about the unprecedented nature of the proceedings. James's radio crackled to life. All units prepare for final security sweep. Her Majesty Queen Camilla will arrive in 30 minutes. The words felt like sandpaper in his ears. Her Majesty Queen Camilla. It sounded wrong, artificial, like a title forced into existence by desperate circumstances rather than divine right or natural succession. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in the Guard during World War II. The old man had shared stories of standing watch during the Blitz, of the royal family's courage during the darkest hours of British history. "We don't serve a person, James," his grandfather had told him. "We serve an idea, a tradition that goes back 1,000 years. Never forget that." A young guardsman, Private Collins, approached nervously. "Sergeant Morrison, sir? The other lads are talking. They say you might not... that you're planning to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. James looked at the young soldier, barely 21, full of the same idealism that had once driven James himself. "What do you think, Collins?" "About all this?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "I think we swore an oath, sir." "To whoever wears the crown, did we?" James asked quietly. "Or did we swear to defend something bigger than that?" The sound of approaching motorcycles announced the royal convoy's arrival. Through the gates came the familiar black Bentley, flags flying, but something felt fundamentally different about this procession. There was no crowd of well-wishers, no sense of celebration. Even the palace staff seemed subdued as they took their positions. James checked his weapon one final time, though he knew he would never use it. The loaded rifle was symbolic, a reminder of the ultimate commitment every guard made to protect the crown. But what happened when the crown itself became the threat to everything you believed in? His radio crackled again. "All units, Her Majesty has arrived. Prepare for ceremony escort duties." Through the palace windows, James could see movement in the stateroom. The Archbishop took his position, ancient words prepared for a thoroughly modern crisis. Constitutional experts had argued for weeks about the legality of the proceedings, but politics had won over precedent. James Morrison stood straighter, his decision crystallizing in his mind. 25 years of perfect service, a spotless record. Commendations from 3 monarchs all led to this moment. He thought of Queen Elizabeth's steady gaze, of his grandfather's stories, of the oath he had taken as a young man to defend the crown and realm. But which crown? And whose realm? The ceremony was about to begin, and Sergeant James Morrison was about to make the most important decision of his military career. A decision that would change everything. News of Sergeant Morrison's defiance spread through the palace like wildfire. Palace staff whispered in corridors, their voices hushed but urgent. Security personnel exchanged worried glances as they realized that one of their most trusted guardsmen had just committed an act that could destabilize the entire ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very people meant to protect the monarchy were now its greatest threat. Sir Anthony Blake found himself in an impossible position. As private secretary, his job was to ensure the smooth running of royal events, but how do you handle a situation that has never occurred in 1,000 years of British history? He stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. "Yes, I understand the implications," Blake said, his voice strained. "But we cannot simply drag a guardsman away during the ceremony. The optics would be catastrophic. Half the world's media is watching." Queen Camilla, now wearing the crown that felt heavier than any piece of jewelry she had ever worn, tried to focus on the remaining ceremonial duties, but her mind kept drifting to the guardsmen in the courtyard who had refused to acknowledge her authority. In all her years of preparation for this role, no one had prepared her for open rebellion from the very people sworn to protect her. Prince William approached her during a brief recess in the ceremony. His face was grim, and she could see the weight of family loyalty warring with constitutional duty in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, using the formal address that still felt strange between them, "we need to discuss the situation outside." "I'm aware of it," Queen Camilla replied, her voice carefully controlled. "What do you suggest?" William hesitated. Perhaps we should consider that this man might represent a larger sentiment. The transition has been difficult for many people." The Queen studied her stepson's face, searching for signs of his true feelings. William had been diplomatic throughout the crisis, but she knew his heart lay with the traditional line of succession. His own children should, by all rights, be next in line to the throne, not the result of constitutional manipulation. Back in the courtyard, James Morrison found himself at the center of a growing crowd. More palace officials had gathered, unsure how to handle the unprecedented situation. The other guardsmen remained at their posts, but James could feel their eyes on him. Some looked angry, others confused, and a few seemed almost admiring of his courage. Colonel Hartwell had been joined by General Peterson, the head of Household Division. Peterson was a man whose entire career had been built on military precision and unwavering loyalty to the crown. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded thousands of soldiers, and never encountered a situation quite like this. "Sergeant Morrison," General Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, "you have approximately 30 seconds to rectify this situation before I have you arrested for treason." James met the general's gaze steadily. "Sir, I understand the consequences of my actions, but I took an oath to defend the crown against all enemies. I believe that includes defending it against those who would diminish its sacred nature. The crown," Peterson said through gritted teeth, "is whoever Parliament and the Church recognize as the legitimate monarch. Your personal opinions are irrelevant. Are they, sir?" James asked. "What about the opinions of the people of Britain? What about tradition? What about the divine right that has guided this monarchy for 1,000 years?" Several palace staff members had begun filming the confrontation with their phones, though security quickly moved to confiscate the devices. But in the age of social media, 30 seconds was enough for word to begin spreading beyond the palace walls. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a constitutional historian who had been invited to witness the ceremony, watched the unfolding drama with fascination and horror. She had spent her career studying moments like this, times when the theoretical foundations of government collided with practical reality. In her academic papers, she had often wondered what would happen if someone simply refused to recognize a monarch's legitimacy. Now she was witnessing it firsthand. Inside the stateroom, the ceremony continued, but the energy had shifted. Dignitaries checked their phones, receiving updates about the situation outside. Foreign ambassadors whispered among themselves, wondering what this meant for Britain's stability and their own relationships with the crown. The Archbishop, meanwhile, struggled to maintain his composure as he led the final prayers of the ceremony. His hands shook slightly as he held the prayer book, and several times he had to pause to collect himself. The words that had once seemed sacred and eternal now felt hollow in his mouth. James's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Sarah, his wife, had somehow learned what was happening. "James, please. The children are watching the news. Come home." The message hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't considered that his actions might become public so quickly. Another message came from his sister, a teacher in Manchester. "Proud of you, Jamie. Someone needed to stand up." Then another from his father, a retired police officer. "You've lost your mind, son. Think about your family." The division in his own family reflected the division he was about to create in the entire country. General Peterson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Morrison, I'm going to give you one final chance. Salute your queen, acknowledge her authority, and we'll discuss appropriate disciplinary action later. Refuse and you'll be arrested immediately for high treason. Your choice." James looked past the general toward the windows of the stateroom, where he could see Queen Camilla speaking with various dignitaries. She appeared calm and regal, but he knew she was aware of what was happening outside. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and James felt a strange mixture of defiance and pity. "Sir," James said, turning back to General Peterson, "I made my choice 25 years ago when I swore to defend the crown. Today, I'm keeping that oath." The general's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. In full view of palace staff, foreign dignitaries, and security cameras, he raised his hand and gestured to the military police who had been standing nearby. "Sergeant James Morrison," he announced loudly enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear, "you are under arrest for high treason against the crown. You will be taken into custody immediately and held pending trial." As the military police moved forward with handcuffs, James Morrison stood perfectly still, maintaining the military bearing that had defined his entire adult life. He didn't resist as they secured his hands behind his back, but neither did he show any sign of regret or submission. The other guardsmen watched in stunned silence as their sergeant was led away. Private Collins felt tears in his eyes, torn between admiration for Morrison's courage and horror at seeing his mentor's career destroyed. The ceremony inside the palace was nearly complete, but outside, the real drama was just beginning. As James was escorted toward a waiting police vehicle, he caught sight of Queen Camilla watching from a window. She raised her hand slightly, perhaps in acknowledgement, perhaps in farewell. James Morrison nodded once, a soldier's salute to an adversary he respected even as he defied her authority. The arrest of a king's guard during a royal coronation was unprecedented in British history. Within hours, it would dominate news cycles around the world and force the nation to confront fundamental questions about loyalty, tradition, and the very nature of legitimate authority. The holding cell at Belmarsh Prison was nothing like the comfortable quarters James Morrison had known during his military career. Gray concrete walls, a narrow cot, and a single window that offered only a view of more gray walls. But James sat with perfect posture on the edge of his cot, his military bearing intact even in civilian clothes. They had taken his ceremonial uniform, treating it as evidence in what was already being called the trial of the century. Outside the prison walls, Britain erupted in debate. Social media platforms crashed from the volume of posts about the guardsman's stand, as newspapers had dubbed it. Television news programs ran continuous coverage, with constitutional experts, military historians, and political commentators arguing about everything from the legal definition of treason to the philosophical nature of legitimate authority. Sarah Morrison sat in her living room in Surrey, watching her husband's face flash across every news channel. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the arrest. Reporters camping outside her house shouted questions through her windows. Her children huddled upstairs, confused and frightened by the sudden transformation of their quiet family life into a national spectacle. "Mummy, why is Daddy on TV?" 8-year-old Tom asked, his eyes wide with confusion.
Did he do something bad?
Sarah pulled her son close, struggling to find words that could explain the inexplicable. How do you tell a child that his father chose principle over family? That he risked everything for an ideal that might be nothing more than stubborn pride? "Daddy believes very strongly in doing what he thinks is right," she said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult choices." 16-year-old Emma, however, understood more than her mother realized. She had been following the constitutional crisis closely, discussing it in her A-level politics classes. While her classmates argued about the legal technicalities, Emma had focused on the human cost. Now she watched her father become the symbol of that cost. "He's brave," Emma declared, surprising her mother. "Everyone's talking about what's legal or practical, but Dad's the only one asking what's right." At Westminster, an emergency session of Parliament had been called. The arrest of a King's Guard during a coronation ceremony raised questions that went to the heart of British democracy. Could the military simply ignore the chain of command based on personal beliefs? What happened when sworn protectors of the crown decided the crown itself was illegitimate? Prime Minister Rebecca Sterling faced the most challenging political crisis of her career. She had supported Queen Camilla's ascension as a necessary constitutional solution, but Morrison's defiance had crystallized all the doubts and resistance she had been trying to suppress. "The rule of law must prevail," she told a packed House of Commons. "We cannot allow personal opinions, however sincere, to override constitutional authority. Sergeant Morrison will face trial, and justice will be served." But across the chamber, opposition leader Michael Harrison rose to challenge her. "The Prime Minister speaks of justice, but what about the justice owed to tradition? To the millions of Britons who believe this entire proceeding is an affront to everything our monarchy represents." The debate raged for hours, with MPs from both sides citing precedents dating back centuries. Some invoked the English Civil War, others the abdication crisis of 1936. But everyone understood that this moment was unique in British history. At Windsor Castle, Queen Camilla struggled with her own crisis of confidence. The successful completion of the coronation ceremony should have marked the beginning of her reign, but instead, it had been overshadowed by one man's dramatic refusal to acknowledge her authority. She sat in the same study where Queen Elizabeth had worked for decades, surrounded by portraits of monarchs stretching back through the centuries. Prince William knocked gently and entered without waiting for permission, a liberty that reflected their complicated relationship. As her stepson and heir apparent, he walked a delicate line between loyalty and honest counsel. "The polls are in," he said without preamble. 43% of Britons support Morrison's actions. Only 37% believe he should face trial for treason. Queen Camilla closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the crown she no longer wore pressing down on her spirits. "And what do you think, William?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think Sergeant Morrison represents something deeper than just one man's opinion. There's a fundamental question about legitimacy that we haven't adequately addressed." "Are you suggesting I step aside?" she asked quietly. "I'm suggesting we find a way to heal the division this has created, rather than prosecuting our way through it." Meanwhile, legal experts debated whether Morrison's case could even be prosecuted under existing law. Professor David Mitchell, Britain's leading authority on treason law, appeared on BBC Newsnight to explain the complexities. "Treason requires acting against the sovereign's person or authority," he explained to the interviewer. "But Morrison's defense will likely argue that his actions were in support of the Crown's traditional authority, not against it." It's a fascinating legal paradox. In his cell, James received his first visitor, his military-appointed lawyer, Captain Jennifer Ross. She was young but brilliant, a former military prosecutor who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of the case. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from him, "I need to ask you directly. Do you want to fight this charge or seek a plea agreement?" James looked at her steadily. "Captain, I've spent 25 years following orders without question. If I'm going to stop now, it won't be because I'm afraid of the consequences. You understand that a conviction for high treason could mean life imprisonment? I understand that some things are more important than personal freedom." Captain Ross studied her client with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Sergeant, I have to tell you, public opinion is shifting in your favor. There are protests planned across the country, support groups forming online. Your case has become about much more than military discipline." Through his small window, James could indeed hear the distant sound of chanting. Protesters had gathered outside the prison, their voices carrying across the walls. "Free Morrison! Defend tradition! God save the true Queen!" But there were counter-protesters too, supporters of Queen Camilla who viewed Morrison's defiance as dangerous to constitutional stability. The nation was dividing along lines that hadn't been seen since the political upheavals of the 17th century. That evening, Sarah Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Despite the media circus surrounding her home, despite the advice of everyone around her, she decided to speak publicly about her husband's actions. She called the BBC and agreed to an exclusive interview. As she sat in her living room, facing a camera that would broadcast her words to millions, she thought about the man she had married 20 years ago, the young soldier who had swept her off her feet with his unwavering sense of honor. "My husband is not a traitor," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He's a man who believes in something bigger than himself. Whether you agree with him or not, James Morrison has never acted from selfishness or malice. He acted from love, love for his country, love for tradition, love for an ideal of service that has guided his entire life." The interview would be viewed millions of times within hours, and Sarah Morrison's words would become a rallying cry for both sides of a nation struggling to understand what it meant to be loyal in a time of unprecedented change. As night fell over Britain, James Morrison lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling of his cell. Outside, the protests continued, the voices of a divided nation echoing off the prison walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences for his moment of defiance. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Sergeant James Morrison slept peacefully, certain that he had done what his conscience demanded. 3 weeks after his arrest, James Morrison had become the most famous prisoner in Britain. His legal team, now expanded to include some of the country's most distinguished barristers, worked around the clock preparing a defense that would challenge not just the treason charges, but the very foundations of monarchical legitimacy in the modern age. The courtroom at the Old Bailey had been transformed into a fortress. Metal detectors, armed police, and concrete barriers surrounded the building as protesters from both sides of the debate gathered daily. The Free Morrison movement had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with supporters traveling from across the Commonwealth to show solidarity with the man they saw as a defender of traditional values. Lady Catherine Ashworth, one of Britain's most respected Queen's Counsel, had agreed to lead Morrison's defense despite intense pressure from the establishment. A veteran of landmark constitutional cases, she understood that this trial would define British law for generations to come. The prosecution's case is fundamentally flawed, she explained to Morrison during one of their preparation sessions. They're asking us to accept that loyalty to the crown means blind obedience to any individual who claims it, regardless of how they obtained it. That's not law, that's tyranny. Morrison, dressed in the simple gray suit his wife had brought him, listened intently as his legal team outlined their strategy. They would argue that his oath of loyalty was to the institution of the crown, not to any specific individual. More provocatively, they planned to question whether Queen Camilla's assumption of full monarchical powers was itself constitutional. "Are you prepared for what this defense will mean?" Lady Ashworth asked. "We're not just defending your actions, we're putting the entire recent constitutional settlement on trial." James nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I've thought about little else for 3 weeks. If my actions were wrong, then I'm prepared to face the consequences. But if they were right, then someone needs to say so publicly." Outside the prison, the movement supporting Morrison had taken on a life of its own. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the constitutional historian who had witnessed his arrest, had become an unofficial spokesperson for the intellectual wing of his supporters. She appeared on television programs across Europe, explaining the historical precedents for resistance to illegitimate authority. What Sergeant Morrison did, she told Sky News, was exactly what the Founding Fathers of America did when they refused to recognize King George III's authority. Sometimes loyalty to an institution requires defying the individuals who claim to represent it. But the movement had also attracted more radical elements. Ultra-traditionalist groups that had remained dormant since the Brexit debates suddenly found new purpose in Morrison's cause. Some of their rhetoric worried even Morrison's most ardent supporters, who feared their hero was becoming a symbol for forces he wouldn't endorse. At Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla faced the daily reality of ruling a nation that questioned her legitimacy. State papers required her attention, foreign dignitaries needed to be received, and the business of government continued regardless of the constitutional crisis. But every official function was overshadowed by empty seats and diplomatic absences that spoke volumes about international uncertainty regarding her position. Her relationship with Prince William had become increasingly strained. As heir apparent, he was caught between supporting his stepmother and acknowledging the legitimate concerns of Morrison's supporters. During their weekly private meeting, the tension finally boiled over. "The Commonwealth realms are wavering," William reported, his voice carefully neutral. "Canada's parliament is debating whether to recognize your authority. Australia's Prime Minister has suggested a referendum on becoming a republic. New Zealand has postponed several ceremonial events indefinitely." Queen Camilla set down her pen and looked directly at her stepson. "And what would you have me do, William? Step aside? Prove Morrison's point that I was never the legitimate monarch? I would have you consider that perhaps legitimacy can't be imposed by law alone," William replied carefully. "Perhaps it has to be earned through the consent of the governed." Their conversation was interrupted by Sir Anthony Blake, whose face was even more grave than usual. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid we have a new development. The Archbishop of Canterbury has announced he's taking a leave of absence for spiritual reflection. He won't say it publicly, but sources close to him suggest he's having second thoughts about his role in the coronation." The news hit Queen Camilla like a physical blow. If the head of the Church of England was distancing himself from her coronation, it undermined not just her political authority, but her spiritual legitimacy as defender of the faith. Meanwhile, in Surrey, Sarah Morrison was learning to navigate her unexpected role as the wife of a national symbol. The media attention had been overwhelming, but she had also received thousands of letters from supporters around the world. Many came from military families who understood the impossible position her husband had faced. "Mummy, there are more reporters outside," Emma announced, peeking through the curtains. The 16-year-old had matured dramatically in the past month, forced to become the family's primary spokesperson when her mother couldn't face the cameras. "Your father would be proud of how you're handling this," Sarah told her daughter. "You're stronger than I was at your age." Emma sat beside her mother on the couch holding one of the many letters they'd received. This one's from a veteran in Scotland. He says Dad did what he wished he'd been brave enough to do. The letter, like hundreds of others, spoke to something deeper than political disagreement. Morrison had become a symbol for anyone who felt that modern life was moving too fast, changing too much, losing connection to the values and traditions that had once provided stability and meaning. Back at the Old Bailey, the prosecution team faced their own challenges. Led by Sir Marcus Fitzgerald, the Crown's most experienced prosecutor, they had to prove that Morrison's actions constituted treason without alienating the significant portion of the public that supported him. "The law is clear," Sir Marcus explained to his team. Regardless of personal opinions about legitimacy, Morrison swore an oath to obey lawful orders. He refused a direct command during a state ceremony. That's insubordination at minimum, treason at maximum. But privately, Sir Marcus worried about the broader implications of the case. If they won, they would be seen as prosecuting a man for following his conscience. If they lost, they would be admitting that military personnel could pick and choose which orders to follow based on personal political beliefs. Dr. Thornton had been contacted by legal teams across the Commonwealth, all grappling with similar questions about the legitimacy of Queen Camilla's authority in their own constitutional frameworks. The Morrison case was forcing legal scholars worldwide to examine fundamental assumptions about monarchy, loyalty, and legitimate authority that had gone unchallenged for generations. As the trial date approached, both sides knew they were fighting for more than one man's freedom. They were fighting for the soul of British constitutional democracy, for the future of the monarchy, and for the right to define what loyalty truly meant in the 21st century. The night before the trial began, James Morrison sat in his cell reading letters from supporters. One, from a young soldier currently serving in Afghanistan, particularly moved him. "Sergeant Morrison, you've shown us that courage isn't just about facing the enemy on the battlefield. Sometimes it's about standing up to your own side when they've lost their way." As dawn broke over London, protesters began gathering outside the Old Bailey. The trial that would begin in a few hours would determine not just James Morrison's fate, but the future of British constitutional monarchy itself. The man who had simply refused to salute had ignited a debate that would reshape the nation's understanding of duty, loyalty, and legitimate authority for generations to come. The ancient oak-paneled courtroom at the Old Bailey had witnessed many historic trials, but none quite like this. Judge Lord Justice Hamilton, a stern man with 40 years of legal experience, called the court to order as James Morrison entered the dock. The defendant wore his civilian suit with the same dignity he had once brought to his ceremonial uniform. His back straight and eyes focused ahead. The jury of 12 ordinary citizens, teachers, shopkeepers, retirees, and office workers, would decide not just Morrison's fate but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. They had been selected after exhaustive questioning about their views on royal succession, military service, and constitutional law, yet everyone knew their personal beliefs would ultimately guide their decision. Sir Marcus Fitzgerald rose to present the Crown's case, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of legal precedent. "Members of the jury, this case is about the rule of law." Sergeant James Morrison took a solemn oath to serve the Crown and obey lawful orders. On October 15th, during Her Majesty Queen Camilla's coronation ceremony, he deliberately and publicly refused to perform his duty. This is not a matter of opinion or political disagreement. This is treason. The prosecutor methodically laid out the evidence. Morrison's refusal to salute, his defiant statements to superior officers, and his continued insistence that he would not recognize Queen Camilla's authority. Video footage from palace security cameras showed the moment of defiance in stark detail, the lone guardsman standing motionless while his colleagues honored their sovereign. "The defendant would have you believe his actions were noble," Sir Marcus continued, "but the law makes no exceptions for personal conscience when it comes to military discipline. If we allow soldiers to pick and choose which orders to obey based on their political beliefs, we destroy the very foundation of military service and constitutional order." When Lady Catherine Ashworth rose for the defense, the courtroom fell silent. Her reputation as one of Britain's finest legal minds had drawn observers from around the world, all eager to see how she would challenge a seemingly straightforward case of military insubordination. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and compelling. "This case is indeed about the rule of law, but whose law?" Sergeant Morrison took an oath to defend the Crown against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The question before you is whether he broke that oath or fulfilled it in the most profound way possible. Lady Ashworth's strategy was audacious. Rather than simply defending Morrison's actions, she questioned the very legitimacy of the authority he had defied. She called constitutional expert after constitutional expert to testify about the unprecedented nature of Queen Camilla's assumption of full monarchical powers. Professor Sir Richard Pemberton, former Dean of Cambridge Law School, took the stand as the defense's star witness. Under Lady Ashworth's questioning, he outlined the historical precedents for resistance to illegitimate authority. The English legal tradition has always recognized that loyalty to the crown is not the same as blind obedience to any individual who claims it, he testified. From the Magna Carta to the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution, our history is filled with examples of loyal subjects who defied monarchs they believed had exceeded their legitimate authority. The prosecution fought back hard during cross-examination, with Sir Marcus challenging every historical parallel. Professor, are you seriously comparing Queen Camilla to King James II? She was crowned according to constitutional law, with parliamentary approval and church blessing. The forms were observed, Professor Pemberton replied carefully, but forms alone do not create legitimacy. That requires something deeper, the consent of the governed and adherence to ancient principles that cannot be changed by mere legislation. As the trial progressed, the broader implications became impossible to ignore. International observers filled the gallery, knowing that the outcome would influence constitutional law across the Commonwealth. Television coverage reached unprecedented levels, with legal experts providing commentary in dozens of languages. The most dramatic moment came when James Morrison himself took the stand. Lady Ashworth had debated whether to call him as a witness, knowing that his testimony could either win the case or destroy any chance of acquittal. "Sergeant Morrison," she began gently, "please tell the jury about the oath you took when you joined the King's Guard." James spoke clearly, his military bearing evident even in the witness box. "I swore to defend Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law. But more than that, I swore to defend the crown itself, the institution that represents 1,000 years of British tradition and constitutional development. And did you consider Queen Camilla to be a legitimate successor when you refused to salute?" The courtroom was absolutely silent as James considered his response. "Ma'am, I considered her to be the beneficiary of a legal arrangement designed to solve a political problem. But legitimate succession involves more than paperwork. It involves divine right, historical precedent, and the acceptance of the people. In my judgment, those elements were absent." Sir Marcus's cross-examination was brutal and methodical. "Sergeant Morrison, you are not a constitutional lawyer, are you? You are not a member of Parliament, a judge, or a member of the clergy. What gives you the right to decide who is and isn't a legitimate monarch?" "Sir," James replied steadily, "I am a citizen and a soldier. I took an oath that requires me to use my judgment and conscience. If those mean nothing, then we are not citizens but slaves. And your judgment was more important than the judgment of Parliament, the Church, and the courts?" James paused, understanding the trap but unwilling to retreat from his position. "Sir, there are some decisions that every person must make for themselves. This was one of them." The trial's most emotional moment came when Sarah Morrison testified as a character witness for her husband. Fighting back tears, she described the man she had married and watched struggle with an impossible choice. "James didn't want to do what he did," she told the jury. "He knew it would destroy his career, possibly send him to prison, tear our family apart. But he also knew that some things are more important than personal comfort. He acted from principle, not politics." During her cross-examination, Sir Marcus pressed her about the practical consequences of her husband's actions. "Mrs. Morrison, if every soldier followed your husband's example, deciding for themselves which orders to obey, what would happen to military discipline?" Sarah looked directly at the prosecutor. "Sir, if every soldier had my husband's integrity and courage, we would have a military that truly serves the nation, rather than just whoever happens to be in power." As closing arguments approached, both legal teams knew they were fighting for more than a verdict. The prosecution argued for order, discipline, and respect for constitutional authority. The defense argued for conscience, tradition, and the deeper principles that law should serve. Sir Marcus's closing was powerful in its simplicity. "Members of the jury, we either have a nation of laws or we have chaos. Sergeant Morrison may be a good man with sincere beliefs, but the law makes no exceptions for sincerity. If you acquit him, you tell every soldier, every police officer, every civil servant that they can ignore orders whenever their personal conscience disagrees. That way lies anarchy. Lady Ashworth's closing was equally compelling. Members of the jury, laws exist to serve justice, not to replace it. Sergeant Morrison stood at a crossroads between blind obedience and moral courage. He chose courage. If we punish courage in service of principle, we lose the very qualities that make us British. As the jury retired to deliberate, the entire nation held its breath. Protesters filled the streets outside the courthouse, their chants audible through the ancient walls. Inside, James Morrison sat quietly in the dock, his fate now in the hands of 12 strangers who had listened to 6 weeks of testimony about duty, loyalty, and the price of conscience. The verdict would determine not just whether James Morrison went to prison, but whether Britain remained a constitutional monarchy or became something entirely different. The weight of that decision pressed down on everyone in the courtroom as they waited for the jury to decide the future of the crown itself. After 18 hours of deliberation spread across 3 days, the jury filed back into the hushed courtroom. Their faces revealed nothing, but the tension was electric. James Morrison stood to face his fate with the same dignity he had maintained throughout the trial, his hands clasped behind his back in military fashion. Foreman Robert Chen, a postal worker from East London, held the written verdict with trembling hands. Lord Justice Hamilton asked the question that would reshape British constitutional law. "Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?" "We have, your lordship." "On the charge of high treason, how do you find the defendant?" The pause seemed to last forever. Outside, thousands of protesters fell silent. Inside Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla stopped mid-conversation with her advisors. In Surrey, Sarah Morrison gripped her children's hands. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Supporters cheered while government officials sat in stunned silence. James Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of months of uncertainty finally lifting from his shoulders. Lady Ashworth allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction, while Sir Marcus gathered his papers with professional composure despite the devastating defeat. But the foreman wasn't finished. "However, your lordship, we wish to add that this verdict reflects our belief that Sergeant Morrison acted from sincere conscience rather than treasonous intent. We call upon all parties to seek resolution through dialogue rather than further division." The jury's statement revealed the careful balance they had struck, acquitting Morrison while urging national healing. It was a typically British compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but offered a path forward for everyone. Lord Justice Hamilton's sentencing remarks would be studied for decades. "Sergeant Morrison, you have been acquitted of treason, but your actions have raised profound questions about the nature of loyalty and legitimate authority in our constitutional system. The jury has recognized your sincerity while rejecting your methods. I hope you will use your freedom wisely to promote the unity this nation desperately needs." Outside the Old Bailey, James Morrison faced the largest crowd of his life. Supporters waved Union Jacks and chanted his name, while reporters pressed forward with microphones and cameras. For a moment he stood silently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his simple act of defiance had unleashed. "I want to thank the jury for their careful consideration," he said finally, his voice carrying across the square. "But this was never about me. This was about fundamental questions that every democracy must answer. What do we owe our institutions? What do they owe us? How do we balance tradition with legitimacy?" He paused, looking directly into the cameras that would carry his words around the world. "I hope we can now have those conversations with respect and civility, rather than in courtrooms and protests." The acquittal sent shockwaves through the establishment. Within hours, 3 members of Parliament had submitted letters of no confidence in Prime Minister Sterling's government. The constitutional crisis that Morrison's defiance had exposed could no longer be ignored or managed through legal proceedings. At Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla faced the most difficult decision of her brief reign. The acquittal had effectively legitimized the questions about her authority that Morrison had raised. Foreign governments were beginning to hedge their bets, with several Commonwealth realms quietly exploring alternative arrangements. Prince William found her in the study where his grandmother had worked for so many years, staring at a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. The irony isn't lost on me, she said without turning around. The first Elizabeth faced questions about legitimacy her entire reign. Now here I am centuries later facing the same challenge. What are you thinking? William asked gently. I'm thinking, she replied slowly, that perhaps Sergeant Morrison was right about one thing. Legitimacy cannot be imposed by law alone. It must be earned through the consent of the governed. The next morning, Queen Camilla made an announcement that stunned the world. In a carefully worded statement, she declared her intention to step aside as monarch while retaining the title of Queen Consort. She would recommend that Parliament invite Prince William to assume the throne, restoring what many saw as the natural line of succession. Recent events have made clear that the unity of our nation requires a monarch who embodies both legal authority and popular acceptance, she stated in a televised address. I believe Prince William, as the son of our beloved Princess Diana and future King Charles III, can provide that unity in ways that I cannot. The announcement was met with relief across the political spectrum. Even Morrison's strongest supporters acknowledged Queen Camilla's grace in recognizing the impossible position her reign had created. Her decision to step aside voluntarily transformed her from a symbol of constitutional crisis into a stateswoman who put the nation's needs above personal ambition. James Morrison learned of the Queen's decision while having dinner with his family for the first time in months. The modest Surrey home that had been under siege by reporters for weeks was finally peaceful, the media circus having moved on to cover the constitutional developments in London. Do you think you won? Emma asked her father, now 17 and preparing for university. James considered the question carefully. I think everyone won, sweetheart. The Queen showed tremendous courage in putting the country first. The jury showed wisdom in finding a path between law and justice. And maybe we all learned something about the difference between blind obedience and true loyalty. Sarah Morrison watched her husband with the children and felt a mixture of relief and pride. The man she had married for his principles had nearly destroyed their family for those same principles, but had ultimately proven that some things were worth the risk. Colonel Hartwell visited James the following week, their first meeting since the arrest. The older soldier looked exhausted by the months of controversy that had torn the military apart. I still think you were wrong, Morrison, he said bluntly, but I understand why you did it. And I respect the courage it took. Thank you, sir. I hope we can move forward together. The new king wants to meet with you, Hartwell revealed. King William believes the monarchy needs to rebuild its relationship with the military after everything that's happened. The meeting between James Morrison and King William III took place quietly at Windsor Castle, away from media attention. The new monarch, who had ascended to the throne with overwhelming public support, wanted to heal the divisions that his stepmother's reign had created. Sergeant Morrison, the king said, I cannot say I agreed with your methods, but I understand your motives. How do we ensure this never happens again? James stood at attention in his dress uniform, restored to him after the acquittal. Your Majesty, by remembering that the crown serves the people, not the other way around. When that gets forgotten, we get situations like the one we just lived through. King William nodded thoughtfully. I want you to know that your service record has been restored in full. You'll receive your pension and honors, but more than that, I hope you'll consider remaining in the Guard. We need people who aren't afraid to speak truth to power. A year later, Sergeant James Morrison stood once again in the courtyard of Windsor Castle, wearing the red uniform he had thought he would never don again. But this time, when King William approached for inspection, Morrison's salute was crisp and unquestioning. Not because he had abandoned his principles, but because he served a monarch who had earned his respect through wisdom and humility. The constitutional crisis that had begun with one man's refusal to salute had ultimately strengthened British democracy. New laws required broader consultation before major royal transitions. Military personnel received additional training on balancing duty with conscience. Most importantly, the nation had engaged in a long-overdue conversation about the relationship between tradition and legitimacy in a modern democracy. Dr. Margaret Thornton published a book about the Morrison case that became required reading in law schools worldwide. The Guardsman's Stand, as she titled it, argued that healthy democracies needed people willing to question authority when necessary, even at great personal cost. James Morrison never sought the spotlight again, but his name remained synonymous with the principle that true loyalty sometimes requires saying no to those in power. He served for 5 more years before retiring quietly to Surrey, where he and Sarah raised their children and tended a small garden. On quiet evenings, when tourists and reporters had long forgotten about the man who defied a queen, James would sometimes walk through his garden and think about the weight of conscience. He never regretted his choice, though he understood the price it had extracted from everyone involved. The red uniform hung in his closet, a reminder that some decisions define not just individual lives, but the character of nations. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary choices, have the power to change history through the simple act of standing up for what they believe is right.